So, welcome back to Aero Consumers Forum 2021. My name is Marco Scialdone. I'm head of litigation and academic outreach at Aero Consumers, and I will be moderating these sessions called My Data is Mine 4 Years Later's New Challenges in Data Governance with four great and young speakers. Giovanni De Gregorio from University of Oxford, Pietro Dunn from University of Bologna and University of Luxembourg, Machi Tsoku, trainee advocate at Chrysostomides Advocates and Legal Consultants, and Laura Somaini, associate at Pearson. What do they have in common? They were all the protagonists of the first two editions of My Data is Mine Award. So before entering the session, let's explain to the audience what is My Data is Mine and My Data is Mine Award. And so let me take you back in 2017 when Aero Consumers launched the initiative My Data is Mine. On that occasion, it was emphasized that the new scenario offered by the emergent technologies required a total different approach than in the past at data protection. And we can say honestly that that intuition has proven to be successful. The data has become an essential resource, some may say an essential facility for the economic growth, for the creations of jobs, for the advancement of society in general. However, the exploitation of such data must not ignore the rights of the consumers. As it was stated in My Data is Mine declaration, only by bringing the consumers at the center of the scene, the data economy can really thrive and avoid dangerous degeneration. That's why 3 years later, in 2020, Aero Consumers established the first My Data is Mine Award to support young researchers in the field of data protections. Young researchers with an innovative approach to data protection in order to exploit the value of data not only as a fundamental right, but also as an economic asset. So the session that we are going to have today is aimed at exploring the new regulatory challenges in data governance. There is a lot going on at European level on regulation level. There are regulations that are directly or indirectly connected with data. So the Digital Services Act, the DMA, the Artificial Intelligence Act. Just this week, the trilogue reached an agreement on the Data Governance Act, the new coming Data Act. So we want to get the perspective of these young and appreciated researchers to understand what is the future and what are the challenges in the data protection in the coming years, starting, of course, from what we have right now. So I will shut up and I will give the floor to Giovanni De Gregorio first and Pietro Dunn right after, because they were the winner of this year of My Data is Mine Award with a brilliant paper that was focused on a particular approach that has been followed by the European Union in the last years, starting from the GDPR, but we are seeing the same approach also in the DSA and in the Artificial Intelligence Act, an approach that can be told as a risk-based approach in the regulation. So I would like to give the floor to Giovanni just to explain what is this risk approach in the European regulation and how is this approach going to impact on consumers' rights, especially with the reference to the Digital Services Act? Oh, I don't know if it's just me, but I cannot hear you.
Okay, now probably you can hear
Yeah.
me. Okay, thank you so much,
Yeah.
Marco. I was just saying it's a pleasure, of course, to be here and share our ideas about the future of the European digital policies, especially looking at the risk-based approach. And particularly, the European risk-based approach is not something just belonging to the framework of digital policies, because it's something also exists in other pieces of legislation in EU law, but it's increasingly spreading around the legal instruments we have already mentioned, like in the field of data protection with the GDPR, in the field of the regulation of content with the Digital Services Act, as well as with the AI regulation, where we have actually a top-down actually approach to the risk that these actors should take into account when implementing these technologies. So this is something actually spreading out in European digital policy, and there is a big shift from a right-based approach to a risk-based approach. So we are not just looking anymore at the question of rights. We are not looking anymore, let's say, at formalities and protecting just rights, and then leaving, of course, the private sector, the public sector, just to comply with one right or not. But we are just trying to entrust the public and private sector once again to behave responsibly. And so this is also why we increasingly see the question of accountability in all these legal instruments. So this is not, of course, this is pretty much the opposite to say that rights are not relevant actually in the risk-based approach, because precisely the risk-based approach, the beacon of the risk-based approach, is precisely the protection of fundamental rights in the EU. And then, having said that, I think that Pietro could also continue talking about why the risk-based approach is so relevant in the DSA.
Yeah, Pietro was the co-author of this brilliant paper. Just to say that if you are curious to read it, please go to the Euroconsumer site, euroconsumer.org. By the way, we have a new version of the site that has gone online just today, so you could appreciate the new look and feel of the site. But you will find there the paper of Pietro and Giovanni, as well as the paper of Maci and of Laura. Please, Pietro.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And so within the Digital Services Act, we can see that there is the risk-based approach is declined in a way which is partly different from that of the GDPR, in that it is directly the European Union that sets different categories of risk. So there are 4 categories in which internet service providers are inserted, put within. And each of this category has to comply with different forms of duties and obligations. What we have noticed in addressing the Digital Services Act is that the risk-based approach, in the sense of a responsibilization of the target of regulation himself, is particularly evident within the 4th category, which is that of very large online platforms. Indeed, in this case, there is a couple of provisions which explicitly require that very large online platforms establish and procedures to assess the risks related to their activities, in particular the risks concerning the protection of fundamental rights of individuals. Moreover, with specific respect to digital privacy and profiling, so processing of data for the purposes of profiling, we have 2 provisions which establish that very large online platforms must be transparent as far as their recommended systems and advertising practices is concerned. So we therefore can see that within the DSA there are many provisions that do not directly prohibit certain practices, but require that as a counterbalance, platforms, especially the very large ones, have to put in place adequate measures to restrict any risks, any potential impacts, negative impacts that such processing activities might have on the rights of individuals, especially on the privacy and data protection rights.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to add you just one thing. One of the main issues that is at the center of the political debate right now at the European Union is the to ban or not to ban the targeted advertising. So from a risk-based approach in regulation, in your opinion, what kind of risk it can be represented by the target advertising? Is a level of risk which can be considered unacceptable, so it should be banned at all, or is a kind of risk that requires only more information to the consumers, but it's something that can be still be considered acceptable as a level of risk for the consumers? I don't know, but maybe
Yeah,
Giovanni, if you want to start.
yeah. If I may reply to this question, this is really critical in the framework of the EU, and the EU is really discussing about targeting advertising, and this really recent proposal that actually have been published quite recently this month, or at the end of November. But what is particularly interesting is that targeting advertising is very useful, especially for allowing consumers to find their products, to access what they like, and so forth. So when we focus, I mean, commercially speaking, targeting advertising is definitely a good thing. It's definitely something we should not ban. The problem is that why the debate around targeting advertising comes from the fact that increasingly we are seeing companies, businesses, or even other organizations supporting, for example, influencers or even their systems to advertising content that are not just commercial but political. And so the problem with target advertising comes when let's say, when market meets democracy in a sense. So, and when market meets democracy, the problem is about how we can ensure that consumers are aware of the fact they are not just exposed to commercial advertising, but they are exposed to advertising that are political and, of course, pursue a political purposes. So this is the big challenge, and this is why a risk-based approach could be important also for very large online platforms, also to assess what are the risks of political targeted advertising. There is not just commercial targeted advertising, because commercial targeted advertising has some traditional issues for consumer law, and of course it's relevant also to regulate that. But at the same time, the big match here is playing on the field of political targeted advertising. That is one of the big issues why we need more clearance and we need more regulation in order to ensure that the consumers that are also citizens, are not actually misled by the spread of disinformation or content published by political figures or influencers or even other public figures.
Pietro, you want to add something to complement?
Yes, very briefly, I think that another important issue with advertising is that well-known of discriminatory practices which can take place with respect to targeted advertising. So on the one hand, not only risks connected to price discrimination, but also the targeted advertising could touch upon sensitive data such as, I don't know, the gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation of consumers. So in this sense, I believe that although it is absolutely an acceptable practice, that of targeted advertising, it must be appropriately regulated to protect individuals' rights to privacy, non-discrimination, and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much. I think that the quote from Pietro, that the problem is when market meets democracy, is one of the takeaways of this session for sure. And if we can make a bridge with another important piece of regulation, the AI Act, and so I give the floor to Maci on this. Maybe we can say that target advertising can be considered as an high risk application, not an unacceptable one, if we speak in the language of the AI Act. So it requires some kind of attention from the regulatory point of view, but it shouldn't be banned at all, because it can be useful, as Giovanni said before. So I will switch to Maci, because we have seen a first approach to the regulation, what we have called a risk-based approach. But for example, in the paper that Maci presented to the My Data is Mine call for paper this year, is really interesting to evaluate another approach that can be taken. so what she called a human right lens approach to the regulation, and that in particular with reference to artificial intelligence could bring to some important results. So I will give the floor to Maci just to speak a little bit about this. Oh, okay. So yeah, we experienced some problem even before this session with this connection. Machi is connecting from Cyprus, and as you can see, internet is not a universal right at this stage, so it changes from state. So we will switch to Laura Somaini. Laura Somaini, as I told at the beginning, is associate at Pearson. And Laura is the first winner of My Data is Mine award. So she started the process in 2020. And what was interesting then, and that the paper of Laura was an interesting intersection between the new class action directive that we discussed a lot today during the forum, and the GDPR. So it was a first hybrid between consumers' rights and data protection rights. So that was really interesting. So if you want to read it, that paper, you find it on the Euroconsumer site. So with Laura, I would like to explore the main theme, of course, of the individual control in the GDPR, but more broadly, of course, a comment on this new data-related proposal. I spoke at the beginning of the new Data Governance Act. There is an upcoming Data Act. More and more data are seen as a sort of immaterial infrastructure for the society. So I think we are in a really interesting moment for the one who are researchers in the field of data protection in general. And I would like to hear about this.
Thank you very much, Marco, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here. So I presented my essay about a year ago, and I sought to answer the question of what was the best approach, what was the best way to frame the relationship between consumers and their personal data. My answer to this question, in short, was an approach of individual control, meaning an approach where individuals are empowered both as data subjects, but also as consumers, to be more in control of what happens to their personal data, as well as to be able to take free choices in the market. In principle, the GDPR does adopt an approach that enhances individual control. As you all know, it provides important requirements in terms of information, of transparency, and also a robust set of data subject rights that are directly exercisable and actionable by the data subject. For example, the right of access has been a strong tool for accountability. Insofar, it has allowed also the beginning of a lot of investigations and proceedings by data protection authorities. However, I focused on one specific right, more particular among the set of data subject rights, which I think is a very good example of the complementary nature of different fields of law within the body of EU law, which all face different but related types of challenges concerning personal data. And I'm, of course, speaking of data protection, consumer protection, as well as competition policy. The right that I'm referring to is the right to data portability, which is enshrined in Article 20 of the GDPR, which really allows individuals to not only request and receive access to their personal data, but also importantly, albeit subject to certain limitations, to request a data controller to transfer their personal data sets to another provider. So it is clear how this right also has some elements of pro-competitive objectives, such as reducing lock-in effects of users and overall aiming to improve market contestability. However, already a year ago, I noted, and although the GDPR is becoming now a more mature instrument, that still the right to data portability remain quite underexploited and is still quite difficult to exercise in practice. 1 year later, I'm happy to report that there have been some developments that are being discussed and proposed, which were also in part announced by the Commission's data strategy in 2020. And one example is within the context of the Digital Markets Act, where in its Article 6, which provides a set of obligations specifically targeted to gatekeepers, provides, among others, the necessity to provide effective data portability, and also particularly towards end users to provide tools to facilitate the exercise by end users of data portability, and including the possibility to provide continuous and real-time access to personal data. This is a very important development because not only does it seek to enhance the right to data portability, but it also goes one step further than the GDPR in providing continuous and real-time access, which is a quite novel and more stringent approach. For example, it has already been mentioned, the Data Act is another example. It has not been tabled yet, but its inception impact assessment was recently subject to public consultation. And what we gather from this assessment is that the Data Act might propose, again, further measures to improve data portability, both for personal data within the scope of the GDPR, but as well for non-personal data, which is also another important side of the discussion. With specific regards to data portability concerning the GDPR, the impact assessment of the Data Act recognizes that there are some shortcomings to date, and that there is a need to provide technical specifications to help individuals to really take advantage of the right, and is also considering the possibility of mandating in the specific context of smart home appliances or wearable devices, which, as you know, are quite intrusive devices that we bring into our lives, the possibility to set technical interfaces to allow real-time portability of data that is collected by these devices during their use. So again, this could be a very far-reaching development. Just to wrap up very quickly, these are welcome developments that can positively impact and increase the effectiveness of not only data portability, but more broadly individual control of data subjects and consumers, and promote a more user-centric environment in the data and digital economy. And it is also positive that they are introduced into these broad and comprehensive horizontal instruments that the Commission has been proposing in the past year in what is called more broadly data law. And just to a final point to conclude, while these are positive steps, I would just like to stress in conclusion that there is still an important role for individuals, both individually but also collectively through organizations and civil society, to really exercise these rights and bring them to fruition, to request and require accountability from organizations, and to really claim control over their personal data. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Really, really, really interesting. I don't know if Machi has joined again or not. I don't see her on the screen, so I suppose not. Talking about the data portability, the most interesting thing is the fact that data portability is becoming the link with data broker in the new regulation on Data Governance Act. So the fact that the GDPR established a link to portability of the data can potentially create a new market for new subjects that are called data broker to manage this kind of right for third parties. And in this, I see a potential role for the consumers organization, because the consumers organization can act as data broker in the upcoming legislation and Data Governance Act. And this can be a game changer in the market, because my opinion is that we live in a sort of captive economy. So we are prisoners of one kind of platforms, because, of course, all our interests are in platforms, our friends are in platforms. So I do not switch from a platform to another, not because the other one is worse, but because all the people that I know are in the other platform. So the fact that I can exercise the right to portability and all the person can exercise this right in an easy way, maybe in a sort of machine-to-machine portability, so without any effort from the consumer, I think it's the real game changer on the market. And I hope, as you said, that Digital Market Act can help in this way. So unfortunately, Machi, I think, is not connecting again, but I would like to involve you. So in this, oh, well, great. So it's Machi is again with us too. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Okay, great. So we were just wrapping up with the speech by Laura. So coming back to Artificial Intelligence Act regulation, I would like to hear from you the different approach that you propose in your paper, hoping that the connection will stay this time.
So in my paper, basically, I want to convey, and I did convey, I think, on a more theoretical level, how or AI regulation should be more regulated based on human rights as such.
Yeah.
There is this approach, but instead that it does need some enhancement. I just want to briefly talk about how this enhancement could come about, also in the act itself, but generally within the efforts of the end. So the first remark I would like to maybe recommend or just state is that an issue of transparency really exists in relation to risk assessments. So currently, when companies want to launch an AI system, they really perform an internal assessment, which is not to be viewed by the public. So the actors themselves pretty much sign off their own systems, which creates a pretty opaque procedure. So a way in which proposal AI Act could come about in the future are the rights of individuals and most relevantly consumers would be to follow basically the example of the GDPR and insert kind of a soft obligation. It is with the publication of data protection impact assessments in the GDPR. So this is just a first idea. Another idea is regarding the creation of solid rights. So the concretization of rights and really translating them into enforceable rules, again, taking the GDPR as an example, really could help consumers and their protection. So for instance, the right to information. As of now, how it is in the AI Act is that information really takes a more internal character and is not so directed to informing consumers about possible, for instance, processing or profiling that they're subject to. So, for instance, this is a pressing need, in my opinion, that there needs to be established a rights section. So, as is in the GDPR, which is really extensive on this matter, that would actually reflect similar principles, but in the AI Act. And just to briefly conclude, I would basically like to state how important it is to create consumer trust. So just a very recent survey, 2019, it covered a very limited geographical scope. It was only for EU countries, but 64% of consumers think that AI is used to manipulate their decisions. So I think that while the European Union is working towards creating solid legislation that could protect individuals and consumers, it can also work into creating trust between consumers. So, and between consumers and the practices that consumers think that affect them in a negative manner. So briefly, that was it from me today. I hope the connection was
thank you.
good.
Yeah. This time was good. So thank you so much.
Perfect.
And on this, let me say that just yesterday we published this survey made by our consumers on the impact of artificial intelligence in cities. And it's interesting, just as you mentioned in this other survey, that consumers want to be more informed about the use of artificial intelligence in the cities. So for public security, for public transport, and so on, they trust the possibility for artificial intelligence to create a better environment in the city, but they want to be informed, they want to know more. So this is absolutely one of the takeaways of the survey. And let me say, if I can wrap up all our session, is absolutely certain that GDPR has been a sort of footprint of the legislation in other sectors and the upcoming legislation in the European Union. We will continue to discuss on this more and more. I can say that My Data is Mine award will be online for 2022 in the first quarter of 2022. So there will be the third edition and there will be some relevant news that will be discovered at the beginning of the year. And so let me thank you for your participation to the panel. Once again, thanks to Giovanni De Gregorio, Pietro Dunn, Machitsoku, and Laura Somaini. And time is running out, so I just leave the floor to the main moderator. And for the wrap-up session, we have distinguished guests, so stay with us.